And well, I will now turn it over to Ian to make a presentation, and then we'll have our usual question and answer. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks. Well, if I'm a bit incoherent, it's because I've only just got up. So also, I was going to do some work on this beforehand, but never mind. You can hear me okay, can you? Can everyone?
Yeah, if you can increase your volume of your mic, that would help.
Is that better? Is that better? No,
okay.
Does that make a difference?
A little.
A little. Okay. I'm going to have to shout out. Let me just try.
Or the closer you can be to your machine, that helps as well.
Okay. Okay. All right. So, right, as I understand it, your group is studying the economics of enough, which is something I'm very interested in, enoughness or sufficiency. That's the key topic. And I suppose the basic message for me is that sufficiency is the safe and just space between a social floor and an ecological ceiling. This is illustrated in Kate Raworth's donut diagram, which I guess you probably know of. The floor is the meeting of universal human needs. That's what I'll argue. And this requires a theoretical and philosophical and normative justification for that. The ceiling, in practice today, is the current best estimate of planetary boundaries. The work of Johan Rockström and others provide some of this. Though all my work has basically been on the climate boundary, Is this okay if I talk at this volume?
No, I think I'm seeing some head shake. I think if you could
I don't know how to get it any louder.
Find a way of increasing it, or perhaps speaking up a bit would help.
Okay. Just have a look.
Yeah, I'm getting a couple of messages that some people are, other than myself, are having a little bit of difficulty. And we certainly want to hear you.
Is that better now? I've changed.
And everyone should make sure that their own volumes are up to maximum on their own machines as well.
Right.
But I know mine is.
Well, I don't know what to do. I can't. I'll try and get as close as possible. Is that all right?
Okay, thank you, Ian.
Yeah. So that's the basic message, I suppose. And I've tried to. I'm currently doing work which is to operationalize this by defining floors and ceilings. And the floors and ceilings apply in three domains of the economy. The first is income and wealth. There's a floor of a decent minimum, and there's a ceiling of excess wealth or riches. In the sphere of consumption, there's a floor of necessities, and there's a ceiling of luxuries. And in the sphere of production and labour, there's a floor of essential labour and a ceiling of wasteful and unproductive labour. So that's the basic argument, but this is all depends on a theory of human need. And you wanted me to talk about needs, so that's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to read this bit out because I want to make sure I don't make any mistakes. So So in the book A Theory of Human Need, Len Doyle and I contend that any coherent evaluation of the human condition requires a notion of universal and objective human needs. Now, in the 1980s, when developing this, it was far from accepted. Across the political spectrum, from economics, sociology, Marxism, political theory, feminism, the dominant view was that needs are always relative to time and space and context and culture. Nowadays, with the limits of the Anthropocene so well understood and increasingly experienced, there's more acceptance of a universal vision of humankind. So what I want to do here is to see how the notion of human needs can contribute to identify the notion of sufficiency. And the central argument here is of universalizability. That whatever is decided to be must be universalizable over space and over time. So it must be universalizable to 9 billion people on the planet today and to future generations. And here I'm going to be talking about our own theory, but there are many parallels with other people, such as Martha Nussbaum, but I won't go into that now. Our theory was published in '91. It's been elaborated since. It built on the prior work of scholars such as David Wiggins and David Braybrook, and has been added to by subsequent scholars such as Des Gasper and Julian Brock. So need refers to a particular category of goals which are believed to be universalizable, and they contrast with wants, which are particular to the individual. And the contrast between needs and wants is central to the argument. The universality of need rests on the belief that if needs are not satisfied, then serious harm of some objective kind will result. We define serious harm as fundamental disability in the pursuit of one's vision of the good, whatever that vision is. So it's a very basic idea. So human needs are universal, and they apply to all people at all times. They must be met in order for people to avoid harm, to participate in society, and to reflect critically upon the conditions in which they find themselves. But at the same time, need satisfiers are variable and context specific. So the distinction between needs and need satisfiers is critical to our theory, as it is indeed to all scholarly theories of human need. So how do we justify this? We do it in two stages. The first presents a thin theory and the second thickens it out. The first stage is based on a neo-Kantian argument which argues that for people to be able to act, they need to have a body which is alive and well, and they need some basic level of personal autonomy. So the argument is, though I can't go into details, that since physical survival and health and personal autonomy are the conditions for any individual action in any culture, they constitute the most basic human needs, those that must be satisfied to some degree before actors can participate to achieve any other valued goals. So social participation, health and autonomy are our basic human needs. At the next stage, we go on to identify some intermediate needs which apply to all cultures, which enhance social participation, health and autonomy in all cultures. For example, so many calories a day for specific groups of people constitute a characteristic of food which has transcultural relevance. And similarly, shelter from the elements and protection from disease applies to all forms of shelter and housing. So we go on to then identify a series of intermediate needs: nutritional food and clean water, protective housing, non-hazardous living and work environments, safe birth control and childbearing, appropriate health care, significant primary relationships, security in childhood, physical and economic security, and appropriate education. And it's interesting to note that these are not all material needs. Some of them are psychological, non-material needs, which enhance autonomy. So this list we put forward, but that others have argued that there are other elements here. Narasimha Rao, in his work, argues that in the modern era, new forms of transport and communication are essential for effective participation, health and autonomy. And this list of intermediate needs is again derived from basically scientific sources. The best scientific technical knowledge we have about relationships between participation, health and autonomy and other factors, and the best sort of comparative anthropological knowledge we have about practices across the world in numerous cultures and subcultures. So it's this codified knowledge which is essential to determining needs. Universal needs, we argue, and others argue, are central to a concept of justice. Wants or preferences flatten moral distinctions between human situations, but claims of need make moral demands on agents that preferences do not. These moral demands concern inflicting harm and meeting basic needs. So there are basic requirements and obligations transcending space and time. So one important link here is that needs provide a strong ethical grounding for human rights, moral or legal claims. While negative civil and political rights are commonly justified by varieties of liberalism, positive economic and social rights usually require some conceptual foundations of universal human needs. And Gillian Brock, who's in New Zealand and Auckland, I think, provides a positive assessment of need theory. She writes, we see that among need theorists, there is convergence on what counts as a need and the needs claims that give rise to appropriate claims of justice. Needs can be a powerful source of powerful responsibilities grounded in concern for justice. There is a role for needs to play in distributive justice that does not displace concern with several neighbouring concepts such as desert or equality. Though there are several ways of interpreting the advice to distribute to each according to his needs, some important guidance on how to establish priorities among different needs claims is also available. The concept of needs is an essential one in understanding distributive justice and the normative landscape. And she concludes, there is essential work that it does well and no other concept does better. So that's my basic spiel on needs. We can come back to that. But the distinction between needs and need satisfiers is also crucial in all approaches. Need satisfiers comprise the goods, services, activities and relationships that contribute to need satisfactions in any particular context. The needs for food and shelter apply to all people, but there exist wide varieties of cuisine and forms of dwelling that can meet any given specification of nutrition and protection from the elements. Without a sharp distinction between universal needs and specific satisfiers, all need theories could justly be accused of being paternalist, intrusive, and insensitive to context and culture. And when we discuss need satisfactions in particular contexts, we need a different methodology to identify them. And we call this the dual strategy. It draws on two forms of knowledge, the codified knowledge of experts, which is still essential, but also the experientially grounded knowledge of ordinary people in everyday lives. The dual strategy, we argue, brings these together. We must bring together both the codified knowledge of experts and the experiential knowledge of those whose basic needs and daily world life are under discussion. It requires a dual strategy of policy formation, which values compromise. In the real world, interests, institutions and power imbalances will thwart it, but we can only insist, following Habermas, that the debate is as informed, participatory and free of vested interests as is possible. So that's the basic setup, and I'm going to avoid reading out any more because it's very boring to listen to, I'm sure. But that's the basic argument for universal human needs. Now, how does this tie in with enoughness and sufficiency? What I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and say a few words then I'm stopping, about these upper and lower bounds, floors and ceilings in these different domains. To do this, I have to distinguish this notion of sufficiency at a national level and at a global level. So I'm going to start off by looking at national sufficiency frameworks for rich countries like Britain and New Zealand. And then I'm going to go on to the global level. So speaking of nation states like ours, there's plenty of work on what constitutes a lower threshold, what constitutes a decent living standard. This has been studied by social policy people for 100 years or more. And it's interesting that now there are approaches which resemble our dual strategy. In the UK, at Loughborough, there's this minimum income line decided by focus groups of different people, elderly families with children and so on, with a light advice from some experts. And in the EU, there's the reference budgets framework. So I think this is all pretty well established, and it builds on a notion of needs, and it tends to result in more generous standards than official income support. Can we determine then an upper threshold of excess? Much more difficult, much less discussed. Though it's now entering the conversation. Ingrid Robbins has developed a notion of limitarianism. It is not permissible, she says, to have resources that exceed what are needed to fully flourish in life when other people don't have necessities met. And there's some attempts to operationalize this by Marcelo Madeiros, amongst others. He says, what sum of money would it take to bring everyone in, say, New Zealand or Britain up to a decent income standard? Then how much income, starting from the top, would have to be retained from the richest in order to achieve that? When you go down the scale, the line at which you get that amount of money indicates the riches line. We've done this in Britain, and we find that this leads to a riches line of £150,000 a year, which is not a bad figure. It's where the top rate of tax commences. It's the salary of the UK Prime Minister and so on. But that's one estimate of what might be a top income line in a country like Britain. Now, the problem is, so that's the national sort of debates, and we can talk about that. But we have to consider this also at the global level. And here there's a strong moral case for universalizability to be applied. The problem then is that, as you know, I'm sure, that there's huge inequality in the world, and the global carbon budget that would offer a reasonable chance of staying within 1.5 degrees of global warming is about 400 billion tons of CO2. Just simply allocating that illustrates the problem. At present, the safe level of emissions per person is something like perhaps 1.5 tons per person, but in Britain today, our consumption emissions are 12 tons per person. So a huge gap here, which has to be bridged somehow. And there have been other reports and estimates along these lines. Now, so turning to the global situation, can we identify a global decent living standard on a world scale? And this has been tackled by Narasimha Rao and other people. They're talking here basically about material needs now. I admit there's a whole range of non-material needs, but they're looking at the material needs. Can we actually deliver a decent minimum to everyone on Earth at the present time within these planetary boundaries. And they put on the theory of need to do this, to identify the basic material requirements as instrumental but not sufficient to achieve physical and social dimensions of well-being. And they divide these into nutrition, shelter, hygiene, clothing, healthcare, education, communication, information, and mobility. And they try to look at default levels here based on research in India, China, Brazil, and South Africa, medium income countries. So this is an interesting idea, and on this basis, people at Leeds University, led by Julia Steinberger and Dan O'Neill, have calculated that there is the available energy and emission space to deliver a decent level of income across the world for all people, without breaking planetary limits. But it does require that this would entail a massive reduction in energy requirements for people like us in the richer countries. They have a very interesting take on what this might involve. So the argument is that of the needs approach is that needs satisfiers, needs trump wants, needs satisfiers trump luxuries. They're more important, and therefore there's a moral case for high emitters to reduce their emissions. How on earth can this be achieved in a world of rampant capitalism, high growth, high consumption societies, and yet democratic societies, or so-called democratic societies? How on earth can this be done? Well, the main glimmer of hope here that I see is citizen climate assemblies, which have experimented with dialogic democracy in a big way. For example, in France and the UK and other countries, about 150 people are gathered together, representing all groups in society. It's a representative group. They spend 6 months on and off in discussing, usually for a weekend every month, advised by a whole stack of experts of various kinds, ways of reducing emissions either to net zero or to achieve a 40% cut by 2035 or whatever. They have achieved near consensus on a whole set of radical shifts, such as phasing out petrol cars by 2025 and labelling of all goods, banning the advertisement of the advertising of high carbon goods and services, things like that. And this is very interesting because they've achieved either a consensus or about a 90% majority for a whole raft of proposals, including, presumably, people who initially were very skeptical of climate change and were opposed to any such measures. So it does seem as though prolonged discussion in this sort of forum can lead to some consensus on how to cut consumption or wasteful consumption or luxury consumption in Western countries. And this is now spreading at the local level. There's nothing to stop this happening at local level, and indeed it's spreading quite fast in Britain, climate citizens assemblies in Leeds and Camden and so forth. So I think this is one way in which we can try to break out of the consumption, high consumption level which we have in today. But the basic argument in my book, and now I'm improvising because I've lost my notes, is that this must be combined with a just and equitable sufficiency. It's quite possible, I suppose, for a sufficiency policy to be not equitable, but it has to be equitable, and that means being equitable also within rich countries. So the poorest and most deprived must still require a series of goods and services in order to live a participatory life in our society today. So we have to find some way of squaring that circle. Another glimmer of hope I've seen recently comes from the COVID pandemic and some of the reactions to that. The UK government in March issued a list of essential occupations, which gave special privileges to these groups during pandemic-related restrictions, in particular saying giving their children access to education when schools were otherwise shut. And it's fascinating to read this list. I don't know if this was also done in New Zealand. It's wide. It's not just health workers, it's food and distribution workers, education, religious staff, of course all the basic utilities, electricity, water, and so on. And I have noted that this is the first time since the Second World War that we've had such a list of determining what are the productive essential jobs in a modern society. We had to do that in the Second World War, but here it was being done again. I think this was interesting because, well, for two reasons. First of all, it said something about social valuation as opposed to market valuation of what jobs are productive, if you like. The neoclassical theory says that whoever's paid is productive, and that's the end of it. And then, of course, it was quite clear and very quickly that many of these essential jobs were low paid or very low paid. And so there was a complete disconnect between market valuation and social norms and social valuation. So perhaps also suggest that the notion that market valuation determines what counts is coming to an end. So this leads me to say that, okay, we can get a notion of sufficiency with a theory of need. We can get the idea of a floor and of a ceiling. But when we do this at the national level, the floors are way, way above what is necessary on a global level for sustainability. There have calculations have been done saying what's the carbon content of the minimum standard of living in Britain and in Finland and in Japan and other places. And of course, it's way, way more expensive in terms of carbon and energy than could be generalized across the whole world. So we have to, I think we have at present two sets of sufficiency notions, one within countries and one across the world scale. There has to be a slow merging of these two. We can't do it suddenly, overnight, and that is the task in a sense. But I suppose the indications from the climate change assemblies suggest that we can make certain moves in this direction from in the rich world. I'm running out of steam, and I think I'll stop there and look forward to discussion.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I'll start off with a couple of questions, and I'm sure that the participants will also want to ask some. Early on in your presentation, you mentioned that there's been an increasing acceptance of a needs-based approach.
Mhm.
And I'm pleased to hear that, because I've often wondered, you know, given how obvious it seems a basic needs approach has merit, it rarely seems to be even discussed. And I'm wondering if you could comment on um, why there has been such a neglect of basic needs, and what do you think has led to its wider acceptance that you referred to early on in your talk?
Well, of course, we have to be careful what we mean by needs. Can you still hear me? Is this okay? Um, it's impossible to have a discussion about sustainability or sufficiency or enough without using the word need. I mean, I defy anyone to do it. But needs is a slippery notion. It's quite logically and grammatically okay for a millionaire to say, I need a second yacht. That's just part of the usage of the term in English and in other languages. So we're talking here about needs as final goals, not about as means to any end. So means to final goals. But then the opposition, I think, basically stems from the idea that these are universal. And I encounter criticism from groups representing indigenous communities or others that say they have a distinct notion of need, which and who are we to say that they're wrong? Who's making this up? And of course that's a powerful argument. But we tried, and this is probably one reason for the opposition to the term, to need theory, coming from this idea of cultural relativism or moral relativism. But the whole book argues that, you know, if we accept cultural values willy-nilly, then we're in trouble, because you know, the rich West can say, okay, this is our way of life, and who's to challenge it? So that there has to be some universal notion in order to achieve sustainability in the near future in this dangerous world. And so I think that is the main reason for its resurgence. I mean, for example, in the research I mentioned at Leeds University, is the ecological crisis and this downward pressure on the safe and just space for living, and that if you accept that downward pressure and accept the current distribution of incomes and wealth and well-being across the world, then we're in for a very dangerous future. So I think that's the main reason that it's now reappearing in the debates.
And it was it struck me in your book, you've compared a basic needs approach with the Sustainable Development Goals. And I found that a very interesting comparison, because you pointed out the similarities and differences between the Sustainable Development Goals, which are you know, referred to in so many sustainability documents and planning activities. And yet when you look at it from a basic needs approach, while there are some positive overlaps, there are also points of divergence. And one of the most interesting was that the Sustainable Development Goals call for continued economic growth. But the basic needs approach points out that growth is not what's needed. It's what growth is supposed to produce that's needed, which is meeting needs. Do you know of any revisions or attempts to improve the Sustainable Development Goals in terms of moving it toward a more needs-based perspective?
Ah, no, I'm not au fait with the discussions there. In my book, Heat, Greed and Human Need, I spent a little time on comparing the needs approach with the Sustainable Development Goals, and say that a lot of the goals are there. I mean, nutrition and education and shelter. So there's a strong similarity between the two, and overlap. They also look at what I would call social preconditions for need satisfaction, like peace and gender equality, which are of a different order. Those are collective issues, whereas needs are always at one point concerned with the individual. So I think there's a lot of the social development goals is a very good thing, and because it represents consensus across the world on these things. But you have pointed to the particular goal. I think it's goal 8, which includes the notion of economic growth, and that's a real problem if that's seen as a fundamental way forward. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and I'll put out one final question, then open it up to participants. And you talk about the basic needs and the sort of secondary level of basic needs and how it's expressed within a particular culture, and how important it is to look at the differences in how it's expressed, even though they're universal. And you point out that the two approaches to helping clarify what these might be, one, the sort of expert information approach, and then the other is the community approach, and suggest that something like a citizens' assembly would be a way of bringing these two approaches together. Are you aware of any attempts to actually do that? I mean, I know that the Citizens Assembly has been used to help nations develop climate policies and priorities, but I'm not aware of it being applied to defining basic needs in a way that can be used in a planning process. Are you aware of any attempts to do that?
No, I'm not. No, I mean, that's a good point. But is it the main point? I mean, that's a bit. I think some of the we need to study what's going on in various towns and cities across the world, and I think here you will find there's these assemblies are defining priorities for what needs to be done, but whether they're coming up with a new sort of a reformed catalogue or idea of human needs, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I hope to be. I'm getting a research assistant soon. I've got a project which is called Valuing What Matters from Efficiency to Sufficiency, and I hope there to be looking in particular at local citizens' assemblies and see what they're coming up with. So I hope I'd have an answer in a year's time or so.
Okay. Questions from any of the participants? Just a second, Joe. Let's see. No, I don't see. Oh, I'm sorry. I think I saw a hand up there somewhere. Can you put a hand up?
There are some comments.
If you go down to the reactions at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions icon. If you click on that at the very bottom, there's a hand up approach. If anybody, and there's okay. We'll start with Gray, and then Mark, and then Sean. Gray, would you unmute yourself and put your question to Ian?
Thank you very much, Ian, for this very important analysis, and it addresses many of the failures of the neoliberal economic system. But the value of looking at needs rather than wants is very important. Of course, the issue that comes up with the neoliberal framework is the role of the needs in driving effort. But I think I suggest it's necessary to look at the production side of things as well as the consumption side. Your reference to the cost of providing services, I suggest is very limited in that needs, just relying on providing money to provide needs, I think is very limited. You've got to see production and consumption as integrated in some way or other, and with some sort of systems that enable these to work together, which requires a lot of competence, a lot of innovation, and not just defining of levels of needs. So there's a whole dynamic within the society that needs to be considered in terms of how to bring these the production and consumption side of society together in an efficient way, which is much more equitable and much more socially positive than the market system that we're.
I think that's right. That's in fact, I was going to say something about this. The needs approach is very close to the idea of a foundational economy. I don't know if you've come across this phrase or the analysis by people in Manchester, and it's very important. They argue there's a foundational economy. It's about 40% of the total economy, which every morning produces all the things we take for granted: electricity and gas and housing and transport and all the rest. They put this at about 40% of the economy. It's very similar to the notion of essential workers that I was talking about before. And I think we do need, in the production sphere, a much more, what's the word, sectoral or zonal approach to the economy. We must start making distinctions. There's this important sector, then there's the sort of export-oriented economy, some of which is okay, some not. Then there's the financial sector, which is completely non-okay, and then there's all the unpaid labour in the domestic sector, which is absolutely essential but needs integrating with the foundational economy. So there is some work going on, which is trying to develop this sectoral approach, which I think can lead to progressive policies which have a chance of being enacted too. I think there's that. On this, you mentioned also money, and this leads to the other sort of practical proposal, which is the idea of universal basic services, which we've developed, and it's spreading fast. The idea that the answer is not universal basic income, but universal basic services, which shifts some consumption from individual to collective. And so you have this in education and health, but to ensure that there are rights to shelter and other essentials need satisfiers in modern societies. So a move towards some shift from individual consumption to collective consumption.
Okay, thank you. Mark, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Jack, and thanks, Ian. My question's sort of broadly around like the assumptions behind the perspectives you shared, and also maybe more importantly, what a change process might be. And so my sense is that I guess off the bat, like everything that you shared sounds very logical and quite helpful in terms of change. However, it does assume that we can look at this at a global level, and that can, by doing so, it can provide a pathway to change. And that may in itself be an assumption that we may learn is not correct. And so I guess my question is, two parts. One is, what other assumptions might you sort of call out as being necessary to be true for the insights that you have to be implementable? And then maybe in sort of a leading second part to the question, is there a pathway other than a more decentralized bottoms-up approach where we actually by policy, or in some ways by sort of taking the permission if it is not given, having more local action that can ultimately enable places where they are to do the work that they need to do to contribute to a shift in this direction that over time in aggregate would add up to the global type of change that perhaps your insights speak to.
Right. Well, I don't make any assumptions about global governance. That clearly doesn't exist, and I can't see it coming very quickly. There's lots of discussions going on, but this is the major problem. We have a global crisis, but no effective mechanism at the global level for dealing with it, and that's the fundamental problem we face. So to get there will require working within the current system of a capitalist system and nation states. It's hard to sort of think this through, but since we have to move fast, next 20 years, I'm not convinced that global capitalism will end in that time, even though that is the main driver of problems. And so I think we have to think about progressive reforms, revolutionary reforms, if we can, within this system, and implementable at nation-state level. There is one global force which might be useful here, and that is global finance, paradoxically enough. I talked to the professor of finance at the LSE, and he's quite optimistic that finance, he says, is fungible. It's not like industry, which has got lots of sunk investments, and the oil industry and all the rest. Finance can switch fast, and he thinks there is a real possibility that fossil fuel industries and others will become uneconomic and unfundable. And there will be a fast move to green capitalism. We'll see, but that's one possibility. And then you mentioned local action. Oh, I have no opinions and no authority on this. I think we must track what's happening. But I am convinced that individual action will not add up to what's required at the macro level. It cannot be enough. We have to decarbonize the entire global economy very fast, and local action will be important, but it won't be enough.
Okay, we have Sean, and then Steve, and then Joanna here. Go ahead, Sean.
Hello, Ian, how are you?
Hi.
I'm just being from the UK, you'll be familiar with the figure of Polly Higgins, from Stroud and her advocacy for ecocide law. George Monbiot wrote an article in The Guardian in 2019 entitled Environmental Destruction is a Crime and Should Be Prosecuted as Such. Can you discuss the need for this as we approach COP26 and talk about the planetary boundaries and major corporations who act with disregard for the planetary boundaries? There's some sort of a legal mechanism by which to reduce carbon emissions. Thanks.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This litigation to actually enforce certain changes. I think there was an important judgment in The Hague recently on challenging one company to or enforcing them to reduce emissions. I'm not an expert on this. I know people think there's great scope here, and in the States, which is a litigious sort of country, there are claims that the oil corporations are undermining the health and well-being of children. We'll see. I mean, my view is we need everything to go on, and I'd like to think that this litigation approach can help, but I can't add anything to that. Sorry.
Okay, Steve, and then Joanna, and then to Gray again. Go ahead, Steve, if you would unmute yourself.
Yes, good evening, everyone. This may be a strange question to raise, but many of the points you've tabled tonight almost have a sort of a religious perspective to them. If you look at a religion like Buddhism, the differentiation between needs and wants and cravings is absolutely fundamental to the core of that religion. So do you see that the major global religions potentially have a role to play in creating a better future for everyone?
Again, I'm not probably the best person to answer that. I haven't thought much about it, but I know certain people are, and people are switching. I'm thinking of Tim Jackson and his recent book Post-Growth, which it seems to be infused much more with a shift in sensitivity and awareness, which has many parallels with Buddhism. I mean, of all the religions, it seems to be the one which comes closest to the concerns that we face today. So I would endorse that. On the other hand, I mean, the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si was extraordinary. I thought was very positive about again mentioning the idea of human needs and our responsibilities to the planet. So yeah, that will all help. This is my
fair enough.
Any port in a storm, right? Yeah. Joanna has a question.
Thank you. Ian, I was very struck by the proposition you made early in your presentation of this, proposing that it's not permitted to have wealth in excess of what's needed to flourish when others have insufficient. And it set me thinking about our relationship with the earth, with the planet, and the destructiveness of the human impact on all the other species of the planet, to the proposition to suggest the proposition that it's not permitted for humanity to extract and pollute beyond what's needed to flourish when other species are suffering from our extraction and pollution, our excessive extraction and pollution. So yeah, I just put that proposition forward as an extension of the striking proposition that you began with.
Yes, it raises lots of issues, this, and I'm just beginning to be aware of them, because looking at some indigenous notions of what well-being what constitutes well-being. There is this notion of a relationship with other species and the earth and the local environment and everything to do in the planet. I was also aware in the past of the deep green argument, which could lead to, I think, dangerous positions. So, in other words, putting the needs of other species or the environment above the needs of people, humans. And I'm absolutely convinced that that's not right. We are unique, and humans, the human species has to have its needs met without damaging other species and the environment. So there's a balance here, but I suppose my starting point, and the starting point of most people in Western thinking, is of people and their needs, which of course must depend on biodiversity and the rest of it. But the starting point, I think, has to still remain the needs of people, men, women, and children, because otherwise we get into very dangerous waters, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Gray, do you have another question or comment?
Yes, Ian. One of the organizational or corporate models which have a lot of people put a lot of hope for is the worker management models, where workers own the company, and there are a number of cooperatives and that sort of thing that have been developed around the world. Do these offer some hope for a more egalitarian society that could make a contribution to the goals that you're looking for?
The answer to that is I don't know. I know that there are people experimenting with this and working on it, but the whole link between the organisation of production and sustainability and sufficiency. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't contribute to that. There's so much going on that I have to restrict your.
Okay, if I may, I have another question. I know in your book, and you made some reference to it, that you actually argue in your book against basic income, universal basic income, and suggest that a universal basic service approach has greater benefits. Could you elaborate on that a bit more, please?
Yeah, I feel quite strongly about this. Universal basic income. Well, it depends what you mean, but if you're taking the fundamental argument, which is that everyone receives regularly through their life an income which is sufficient to live on, that is just pure for the birds. That's just going to take half the GDP just to finance that, and has many problems associated with it. This is one reason why we've started to think about universal basic services. The notion that people have entitlements to meet life's essentials. That's the idea. So it comes back to the notion of needs, and we can look at all these essential areas: health, shelter. That's important increasingly. I'm looking out at London here, and hundreds and hundreds and thousands of empty luxury flats and many homeless people and so forth. So the idea is that you provide entitlements to basic needs satisfiers. And there are many arguments for this. I mean, one is that it's automatically very redistributive to provide services financed from general taxation, even if the taxation is not progressive, is redistributive. But also there's growing evidence that it's more sustainable and ecologically sustainable. For example, if you compare the US healthcare system with those in Europe, its carbon footprint per person is 3 times greater than the European healthcare system, and the level of benefits provided is in some respects worse. So this is an argument for collective provision as opposed to individual incomes, which are then used to purchase commodities and services in the market. So those are 2 fundamental reasons, I think, for trying to switch some provision from incomes to services. And so examples of this would be free bus services, for example, in Britain. I mean, we have it. I have it as an elderly person. Extending that to the whole population, that would be one example of a universal basic service approach. And I think now we have this website called the Social Guarantee, which I urge you to look at. It's just socialguarantee.org, I think, where the proposal is for, we do need, of course, an income guarantee, but not a universal basic income given to all. An income guarantee plus wider universal basic services.
Just a quick follow-up on that. Could you comment on the potential for modern monetary theory to be applied to support universal basic services? Because often the argument is, it's too expensive. We need austerity. We need to tighten our belts and so on.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a big issue. Now, it's also an issue with the Green New Deal, which kind of ties in very well with universal basic services, especially in the housing field. But both require upfront investment. And so the question arises, how do you fund this? And it is interesting, the modern monetary theory approach. Some people I know and admire, like Anne Pettifer, are very much opposed to it. But I think we are entering. I think we're moving to a new era. I think. I don't know if this is in modern capitalism. I think the era of austerity and neoliberalism and money is probably crumbling, and so there's more scope for extensive borrowing and possibly money creation to fund these plans.
Yeah. Thank you, Ian. We'll have Pat, Basket, and then Mark. And if everyone hasn't seen Pat's excellent article in Newsroom today, I encourage you to have a look. Go ahead, Pat.
Thank you. And of course, your excellent article earlier in the week. I have what's perhaps a slightly naive question, but I would like to know how far the old-fashioned proper welfare state is different from what you're suggesting, Ian.
Well, I've just written a paper on that. It's part of a report for the European Trade Union Institute. So I hope that'll be available soon. No, the old-fashioned welfare state is very important. It's important for climate reasons as well. The IPCC report recognizes that Europe's got more adaptive and more resilience because of the welfare state, the old-fashioned welfare state, than countries without it. So I'm not knocking it, but it needs to be extended to these new areas, I would suggest, especially, well, in Britain, I don't know about New Zealand, the 2 priority areas are housing and care. We need a national care service, and we need real guarantees of security and housing. So I think what UBS is actually a reformist program. It's not revolutionary. It's saying, keep the welfare state, but extend it in these ways. And on the money side, move away from punitive sanctions to a better system of providing a minimum guaranteed income.
Thank you.
Mark, you have another question.
Yeah, thanks,
I have
Jake.
to go.
Oh, go ahead, Ian.
I was just saying I must leave in a minute or two. But go ahead.
Okay, just in to push a little bit more on how this this change that we're all very much interested in being a part of might happen. My sense, given that there's been no shortage of great ideas in economics with regard to all of these things, as far back as the Club of Rome and then Elinor Ostrom and some of the people who've gotten a lot of attention of late in this space. But in that time, there really hasn't been, from my perspective, a whole lot of meaningful change in a different direction. And so, I wonder if you have any thoughts on why that might be, and perhaps as a starting point, is it possible that sort of the privileged people that ultimately have a larger influence over our economic system at the moment have not yet experienced enough suffering to provide motivation for change that will both benefit them and others in the equitable way that we all might be interested in it happening?
Well, that could be true. Well, I mean, it's just like the Irish advice on how to get to Dublin. I wouldn't start from here. We're in one of the worst possible places to start. A period of extreme neoliberal capitalism with rocketing inequality and massive emphasis on growth and consumption. So it's not good. And indeed, I think the objective situation now is worse than when we were writing the Needs book in 1980s. I mean, so it's not a good place to start, which I suppose explains the lack of progress. But now, I mean, I think Paris was important. The Paris Agreement. It was an agreement, and it set out a time path. We'll see what happens in Glasgow. I like to think there's a possibility of moving forward still. I've been struck by this wonderful book by Kim Stanley Robinson. Have you come across it? Called The Ministry for the Future. I recommend it. It's a long novel, which starts off with a terrible heat crisis, and is in the near future, but ends up with an optimistic scenario that we can actually finally do it. But it's interesting that the scenario depends partly on sort of violent terrorist tactics, and secondly, well, I suppose that's the main sort of, and also on some forms of planetary engineering. So it's difficult to keep up hope, but what else can we do? That's not very.
Yeah, one of the things that occurs to me about Mark's question is something I've been thinking about too. The issue is we've seen so little change on so many important issues. Are we beyond policy? Is the institutions actually going to fail? And do we really need to be thinking about localized resilience as a way? And I don't expect you to answer that, because Pat may have her hand up for another question, or you just left it up there. Okay, but perhaps that's a topic our group could explore in some later sessions, because I think we're probably coming to the end here. There was one other thing I wanted to just ask about, Ian, and that is, again, in your book, at the end of your chapter on human needs and sustainable well-being, you make the comment about equality being a precondition for the transformation needed for a needs-based agenda. And it kind of seems like a chicken and egg issue, that we almost need a needs-based approach to achieve equality. And I just wondered if you have any additional thoughts on that, or insights to put a perspective on the relationship between,
Yeah.
equality as a precondition and adoption of a needs-based approach.
Yes, well, there are people who argue that they're different things. The sufficientarian argument, that's a sufficientarianism, says that what matters is bringing everyone up to a basic level, and what happens above that doesn't matter. It can be as unequal as you like. I think that's being knocked out of the water now by the sheer sort of problems that we face, given the ecological crisis. But Gillian Brock, who, as I say, is in Auckland, I think, argues, I think convincingly, that there's much more support for a needs-based approach than for equality. Equality is seen as rather radical and difficult to implement. What's it mean? But emphasizing needs and bringing everyone up to a needs standard has more traction, more traction than talking about equality. And when coupled with the notion of ceilings, which is going to happen, will actually move the debate towards equality. So I think in terms of political traction, the needs argument is better and ties in more with our basic notions of well-being, because it's specific and it says, and it's non-substitutable. That these things, education, nutrition, housing, security, are all important, and you can't give a starving boy a course, an education course. They're different things, so it's more concrete in a way, and it's more believable than talking about abstract notions of equality.
Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of a very interesting discussion, and I really want to thank you for getting up so early and probably giving up part of your breakfast.
I'm going to go and have it now.
I really want to recommend to all of you Ian's book, Heat, Greed, and Human Need. It's a very well-written, very accessible, very comprehensive discussion of many of the issues around basic needs and their relationship to sustainability and climate and equality and many of the things that we care about. And Ian also has a website where his latest publications are available that you can access. So again, Ian, thank you very much. Much appreciate it. And we'll be putting this recording on YouTube, and I'll send you a connection when that's done. And we often get many additional views. So I'll, on behalf of all of us here,
we made contact.
Indeed. Thank you very much, and be well. And good night to the rest of you, and hopefully we'll see you for the November session of the Economy of Enough, when we'll be looking at the whole issue of biocapacity and overshoot at the local level here in New Zealand. So look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you. Night night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.